Shui Chen. Air is part of my memory. It's a very important ingredient of my memory. We breathe in and out. We collect things, emotions that linger in our realities. We take it in. We breathe all the time, in and out, but we don't notice it. It's almost as how we take in reality and transform it into memories that we recall sometimes.
Yadi, I do think about air, especially when I'm nervous. I'll feel the air changing. It's more like the atmosphere. Not only the air, I will feel the air become heavy and I will feel stuck.
Veronica. In my childhood, I don't really remember that air being smog. We would call it sandy.
Xiaolu. In the winter, when they start burning coal, there is this smell of stone, like stone coal in the air. So you smell it all the time. It's not only entering your nose, but if you concentrate, you can really taste it in your mouth.
Shen Qiang. I will say in Chinese that air is very familiar. It also means that the atmosphere or the feeling is the same. It recalls your memory. For me, it's definitely more than smell. It's a combination of different things. It's multiple material stuff. It's an assemblage.
Shuyu Chen. There's this word, sharing the faith, breathing the air together. It comes from political propaganda. It means if you breathe air together, you share the same destiny, the same fate. You're heart to heart connected, and you should fight for the same purpose. So that's a very ironic expression now. If we're breathing the same bad air now, what future will we then share together?
Over the past decades, the rapidly expanding and increasingly urbanized Chinese capital has been hit by frequent air pollution events tied to health-threatening concentrations of fine particulate matter. The attention received as a result of the extensive international media coverage has epitomized Beijing as an iconic imaginary of air pollution in the 21st century. Beijing has become a contemporary analogy to early iconic imaginaries of pollution, such as the London smog of the late Victorian era or the photochemical smog of Los Angeles. Even so, regardless its critically poor quality, air quality, Beijing currently ranks only as 57th amongst the most air-polluted cities. And cities elsewhere are experiencing significantly more extreme levels of particulate pollution that rarely get any attention. In Europe, we might see air pollution as a thing of the past or associated with places far away. But the relative clearing of EU airspaces is directly related to the displacement of polluting industries from the west to the east. Our inquiry has been developed as a collaboration between visual artists and environmental scientists, and together we explore new imaginaries of air in Beijing and the connection between the embodied experience of living in toxic air and the new roles which technoscience performs in bridging air with the new modalities of environmental governance. Our work has been informed by the aerial accounts collected by Hanna during her 3-month research period in Beijing in autumn 2016.
Coming to air at the intersection of philosophy, politics, science, and lived experience, the installation Often People Ask How Birds Are Affected by the Air looks at how air, that is unruly when it comes to borders, functions in the human imagination. It uses 3 audiovisual elements. In blue, the protagonists talk about their relation to air, about how it's noticed, lived with, distributed, and governed. In the video, I used a blue screen as background, resonating with what has become known as APEC blue, the relatively clean blue skies often seen alongside important international events and meetings such as APEC, the 2008 Olympics, and national holidays. As a result of forced shutdowns of vast amounts of factories, often letting workers go unpaid. The voices are echoed in written text, summoning the translation and variations taking place between spoken versus written language and between cultures. In color code, colors gradually fluctuate from green to yellow to orange and red, accompanied by a soundscape that evokes the colors used to indicate the air quality index and the presence of solid matter in the air. For this, I worked with composer Claire Bossy, who, based on these colors and on a third video, Media Imaginaries, edited from YouTube clips to draw forth the materiality of existing aerial imaginaries conceived for variations of sonic air. Media Imaginaries acknowledges the weight and importance of existing imaginaries for how we continue to perceive and relate to air. These different elements form a heterogeneous multiplicity, rooted in specific locations, embodiments, and partial perspectives. These standpoints are not innocent, nor are they automatic or unproblematic. However, as Donna Haraway has argued, a vision from below might provide an adequate account of the world in comparison with ostensible, objective accounts. This is because we are used to recognizing ethnographic registers as partial and therefore practice suspicion.
During her residency, Hanna approached locals, asking them about their relations to air, about how it is noticed, lived with, distributed, and governed. Adopting dialogue as the central methodological practice resulted in an extensive collection of audio recordings and transcripts which recount the experience of living in the dense Beijing atmosphere. The Beijing narratives, or how we call them aerial accounts, tell about air as having always been heterogeneous and troubled. We learn about previous dust storms that affected everyone and how with the smog. It's only little by little when you realize that so many people get cancer, get a lung problem. Certain newspaper or media start to talk about it, and then it became a problem. These accounts incorporate fragments of accumulated histories, as well as elements of sedimented personal and communal experiences, and provide an entry point for challenging the dominant representation of Beijing as a smog city. They serve as a kind of situated evidence, informative of changing environmental imaginaries and sensibilities. It was striking that within the rich narrative terrain of aerial stories, there was a broadly shared importance given to recently emerged real-time measurements and new air quality indexes enabled by digital technologies. With the emergence of the new concept of WUMAI, a new word for health-threatening smog, a new indexes such as National Air Quality Index was introduced to Chinese public in January 2013. This index is calculated from 6 atmospheric pollutants, out of which PM2.5, particular matter smaller than 2.5 micrometer in diameter, was singled out as the most health-threatening.
Because of its invisibility, our perception of air is always mediated. Processes of making visible are not the privileged domain of art, but importantly the foundation and the foundational gesture of modern science. This is particularly apparent when it comes to air and its different manifestations. In the Chinese context, PM2.5 was introduced to a broad public by media reporting on the infamous airpocalypse event of January 2013. In 2015, PM2.5 was introduced as an animation in Under the Dome, Chai Ying's self-financed but extremely influential TED Talk-style documentary on air pollution in China, which was viewed 300 million times in 1 week before taken offline by the government. Although we perceive smog or dust, PM2.5 is too small to be perceived directly. The fine particulate matter are known and knowable only with the aid of science, or perhaps invented by science. Airborne matter comes in many forms and could be expressed in different ways. PM2.5 is a cheap and robust, but arbitrary measurement that detects size or mass. High PM2.5 values have been found to correlate to a range of medical conditions and increased mortality in epidemiological studies. Importantly, PM2.5 can be assessed using sensors that produce continuous real-time measurements. This data can be processed automatically and shared as a continuous flow of numbers, providing immediate information on the particulate content in the air. Many of the Beijingers I met emphasized the importance of these recently merged real-time measurements of pollution. Encountering the AQI in news and smartphone apps alongside weather predictions, PM2.5 is naturalized. Rather than a representation of a certain environmental condition, PM2.5 becomes an environmental condition with material presence. Becoming an environment, it influences new forms of individuation and modes of existence, impacting conceptualizations of inside and outside, everyday behavior, and decisions where to live. The data does not simply represent the urban ecosystem. It infiltrates the relationship that makes up the urban fabric, producing ecologies of data rather than simply ecological data. This development feeds into a broader paradigmatic shift and the rise of the regime of environmentality, a governing of and through the environment, enabled at least in part by these new sensing technologies.
Evoking techno-ecologies of air rather than separating the technologies and ecologies of air provides a useful reference point for understanding the nature-cultural entanglement of air. Techno-ecologies of air are not merely technologies that inform ecology. Since the 1970s, the ecologization of thinking has been facilitated by cybernetization and the spread of digital technologies. Using these same technologies to access the imperceptible dimensions of air, science gives emergence to the new environment. In the case of IQI and PM2.5 indexes, these are not discrete material elements there waiting to be discovered, but scientific abstractions fully dependent on technological apparatus. Nonetheless, they have material consequences and influence our perception of urban air. As the air becomes this number, our scrutiny shifts from incalculable social, economical, and environmental contexts and perceptual experiences, such as smell and dust, to the invisible but calculable milieu. Following Antoine de Rouvroy, we ask, what new processes, agencies, and subjectivities arise from this so-called perceptual revolution? And why does it matter? The shift to big data sensing technologies has been observed to go hand in hand with the implicit belief in a big data's ability to anticipate most phenomena. The computational turn bypasses and avoids any encounter with the human reflexive subjects, Rouvroy says. Using big data to construct models of behaviors and patterns spares human actors the burden of responsibility to transcribe, interpret, and evaluate, and to consider cause or intention. It can potentially delimit the urban subjects to series of actions focused on monitoring and managing data. The data-driven environmental sensing technologies enable citizens to minimize their health risks. However, unlike some other forms of smart citizenship which citizens may opt in or out, the toxicity of urban air is an environmental condition that cannot be opted out. Breathing the air is necessary, whether it's toxic or not. In a long-term perspective, applying big data to environmental governance or algorithmic governance shifts the agency from individual citizens to populations and provides little forms of public engagement.
By tracing some of the heterogeneities of Beijing's air, we have outlined the emergence of techno-ecological networks and distinctly techno-scientific concepts of air. These are centered around a datafied conceptualization of air that alters and diminishes the heterogeneity and materiality of air into digital high-resolution data flows, and that further, through processes of algorithmic governance, such as the digital sensing of air pollution, data flows, and citizen responsiveness to the numbers, reduces air to a means of population control. This epochal shift in the way urban air is imagined and conceptualized stretches beyond what is perceptible through our senses. It produces a new perceptual regime which relies on invisible but calculable or measurable aspects of the milieu. As environmental big data becomes a norm, the visualization of data flow is increasingly celebrated. Art can then be seen given a task of making expert data intelligible and appealing for a non-scientific public. In her analysis of the modern history of vision, Orit Halpern argues that the current shift towards data-driven research is related to the valorization of visualization as the benchmark of truth and as a moral and democratic virtue. In the era of algorithmically defined rationality, visualization emerges as a set of techniques to manage, calculate, and act on quantifiable, observable, and measurable populations in society. By extending the analogy between air and art, is art not at risk of being seized by this logic of algorithmic governance as well? What meaningful alliances can surface between art, science, and technology, as technoscience and digital technologies predetermine our environmental sensibilities?
In our exploration of air, we believe that tracing relationships that assemble around and in air requires attending to various locations of information and demands a combination of approaches, including empirical methods, ethnographic research, and critical theory. We do not want to disregard the disciplinary histories that have inevitably structured the way we think and relate to the environment, but neither we want to reduce art to awareness raising and science to the data-producing machinery. By producing a multiplicity of interrelated outcomes such as installation, performance, and more academic texts, our intention is to acknowledge that air, as a nature-cultural phenomenon, necessarily requires a reassessment of the disciplines that make up our understanding of it. The new emergent relationship between air, technology, and city inhabitants require new methodologies or ways of knowing. Learning and experimenting with how to access these new techno-ecological registers and give visibility to emerging new subjectivities might be for us the locus for troubled but potentially productive meeting point for art, science, and technology.
Thank you.